Hi guys, so today I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the warrior path for Raiders of Dune Sea. As with all my guides, there are going to be timestamps in the description below if you want to jump to the sections that might be more relevant to you and your particular playthrough of the book. And any sort of spoiler stuff I'll try and kind of keep towards the end of the video. Okay, so let's start by looking at the core mechanics of Warrior. Now, I feel like I never really nailed this class in my previous books. I think it was the one that I always struggled with the most. I feel like it lacked kind of identity, largely because it's really tricky to balance three stats on equipment, needing speed, brawn, and armor. Often, in the previous books, if you were trying to go for a tankier style of warrior, you were kind of having to make difficult decisions about the stats you took, and you're more likely to be piling on armor at the expense of losing brawn, which would essentially just make you ultimately weaker in combat. It just made Warrior a really challenging and difficult path to kind of get right. So in Raiders, I kind of went back to the drawing board to consider just what I could do to make this class just, kind of feel fun and, challenging to play, but rewarding, So I identified three key strengths or characteristics which I wanted to kind of bring to the fore. And you'll see that these sort of three areas kind of become the basis of the hero builds that we will be exploring in this video. So first, the warrior, one of its key strengths is that it is great against multiple opponents. So when they are outnumbered, then they basically shine. They have many abilities that will allow them to, cleave through hordes of monsters, no problem. Secondly, armor, of course. Yes, I wanted to make armor relevant again for this book, but interestingly, you don't need to stack huge amounts of armor onto your hero, because there are now a slew of amazing abilities that will allow you to raise your armor and to use it to buff your attacks. The third characteristic ties in with the default ability that you now get when you learn the warrior path. So it's an ability you get for free. So for warrior, this free ability is called Last Defense. And basically, if your health is 10 or less, you can raise your brawn by 2. So it may not seem like a super powerful ability from the get-go, but you'll see how this characterizes and leads into the third strength of warrior, which is blood frenzy. And we'll talk a lot more about that later. So stats-wise, of course, you want speed as always to stay competitive with your opponents. When it comes to brawn versus armor, the age-old debate, I would say always favor brawn and keep that stat as high and as healthy as possible. Armor does not really need to be above 6. And that even includes tank builds, believe it or not. And I'll explain all that and we'll revisit that later. I haven't gone mad, don't worry. Okay, so let's start looking at builds and abilities. So first off, core abilities. Now I term these core abilities because they're just super useful to have and will serve you well on your adventure, but they're not essential to every build. Thorns a great passive ability. It deals damage to all opponents each round. It's only available to warrior in Raiders of Dune Sea and Wrath of Ragnarok, so I highly recommend it, definitely. You've also got Fatal Blow and Impale, great combat abilities for delivering extra damage. If you want to couple these with modifier abilities such as Malice and Mortal Wound, that will basically add even more damage on top, then you can see how warriors can really start to give rogues a serious run for that top DPS spot. Of course, speed abilities, always great to have. Haste and knockdown, quite common on warrior items. And of course, recall, which I probably talked about a lot in previous guides. It allows you to reuse a modifier ability. So basically it brings back a modifier ability that you've used to allow you to use it again. So it can imagine how great that is to pull back a Malice or a Mortal Wound to use it again. So yeah, another bit of damage boost. Now, because warriors have more health than the other paths in the game, so warriors will have 45 health for the majority of this adventure, then Dark Pact becomes a little bit more attractive because it lets you sort of trade some health for another damage boost. Now, Sixth Sense does get an honourable mention here. I know that in my previous guides I told you that this ability is just broken, it's essential, it will just save your life more times than you can ever imagine. However, with Warrior, basically you get Sixth Sense on a ring early on in the game. But for Warrior, there's so many really good rings that have kind of key skills attached to them that you may find that Sixth Sense actually gets sidelined. So by all means, keep it, use it. It's a fantastic ability, but hey, don't be afraid to lose it. Okay, so the first build I want to focus on is the Blood Warrior. So, as the name implies, you can guess that bleed is the main focus here. The Blood Warrior kind of plays into that new strength or characteristic, which is just smashing the living daylights out of as many opponents as possible. The Blood Warrior wants to be outnumbered. They're great against hordes, so the more enemies, the happier they are. And why is that? Well, we want to pick up Cleave, and we boost that with Cyclone, and you're doing great damage to all of your opponents, ignoring their armor. And of course, this will spread your bleed effect to all of those. There's also Furious Sweep too, which is a kind of later game ability, but is an advanced form of Cleave, which will just give you even more AoE damage. And if you feel you want to go all in on this style of combat, then there's also Scythe and Skewer. Again, great abilities against multiple opponents, although they're probably more useful for if you need to kind of finish off a bunch of low health enemies. So we complement this build with Spring Strike, which lets you increase your speed for one round based off the number of wounded opponents. So that's a great little ability for kind of almost guaranteeing winning a combat round. Now, important mention, in Raiders of Dune Sea, it was originally a speed ability. This has been changed, updated in the Wrath of Ragnarok, and is now a modifier ability, which makes it even more useful and playable. And also, just to finish off this build, we've got Unshakable, which similar to Spring Strike, but it raises your damage score based off the number of wounded opponents. So, as you can see, the Blood Warrior is just really all about damage. And so we can look back towards our core abilities that we looked at, and abilities like Malice and Mortal Wound that will buff your damage, of course, are great to add into this build. And Thorns, which we talked about, which is a great passive ability, is great for this build because the focus is just damage, and more damage. And the Blood Warrior is all about ending combats fast. So they're, in that regard, a little like Rogue. So Armour is kind of a bit of an afterthought here. They don't actually mind taking a few hits because this build could also make use of the Blood Frenzy mechanic. So let's take a look at this. So here we are, let's look at the Frenzy build. So basically, these are a host of passive abilities that simply just trigger when you are at 10 health or less. So yeah, so it's a bit of a tricky danger zone to be in, but typically by that stage of a combat when, your health's down and things are looking perhaps a little bit bleak, then you're usually wanting to pull out all the stops to end a battle as quickly as you can, and Blood Frenzy will definitely help you do that. So let's quick look at these abilities. So you have like Last Defense. It gives you a +2 brawn boost when you're in this danger zone. As we talked earlier, this is a free ability that is just a default ability that comes with Warrior. Rapid Pulse is fantastic because it will increase your bleed damage while you're in Frenzy. So that obviously is great for a Blood Warrior. Rebuke is great because it allows you to add 1 to each die you roll for damage. And then if you're able to acquire it, and it is a tough item to get, Soul Burst is an absolutely superb ability because basically what happens is when you die, Soul Burst resurrects you back to 10 health, which means not only do you avoid death, but you come back in Blood Frenzy. So it just allows you to just kind of keep going with all these passive effects in play. Crazy stuff. And, there are more Frenzy abilities in Wrath of Ragnarok. So lastly, we have a more traditional tank build. Now, I call this a tank build because unlike the kind of berserker nature of the Blood Warrior, which is just wading into the horde, smashing in true barbaric fashion, this build is probably more about kind of careful control. It's about resilience, and it's about having the skills to kind of sustain yourself through some of the tougher and longer combats. So if you think about the Blood Warrior as a barbarian, then the tank is more of a kind of skilled tactician. Now, the tank build does not mean you need to pile on armour until you can barely move. In fact, quite the opposite, which might sound counterintuitive, but let's just look at some abilities first. So we kind of have counter, overpower, retaliation, sideswipe, which return from previous books. They are abilities that will deal damage to your opponent when you lose a round, or they can help turn a loss into a win. They're basically great defensive abilities, and then when coupled with a certain career ability, which I'll be talking about soon, then they become even more powerful. Now, Bulwark is a key ability because it lets you deal damage to an opponent equal to your current armor score. Now wait, I know everyone is staring at their screen in confusion and thinking, Michael, you said armor is not important. What's going on? Well, for this build, you want to aim for a sweet spot of around 6 armor. No more is really needed, and you can attain that easily enough through chest pieces and either a gloves or head item and or a shield. We can then use modifier abilities to buff, this stat. So that's where things like Might of Stone and Iron Will come in. You also have Resolve, Frost Guard, and Bull Guard. All these boost armor. So you can keep them in reserve if you need to raise your armor stat to soak up some damage, or you can use them to raise your armor in a round to then use Bulwark to deal damage. So it gives you a lot of versatility there. We've talked about Recall as one of the really good core abilities that allows you to reuse modifier ability. Well, Shadowwell, which you will get in Act 2, is one of the new warp abilities, and it allows you to trade health to do exactly the same thing as recall, which is to bring back a modifier ability. And that's a great thing for this build because you want to be bringing back your armor boosting abilities. Now, I'm going to touch on careers and their abilities and also pets. So, you know, if you kind of don't want any spoilers whatsoever, you might want to switch off now. There are only kind of minor spoilerish things, but, you know, obviously, if you want to avoid that, then I understand. Okay, so for Blood Warrior, the obvious career choice is the Dervish. Because they have Sand Dance as one of their abilities, which deals damage to all opponents equal to the brawn value of your equipped swords. And yes, you want to be dual wielding swords with this build. The Dark Templar is the perfect career choice if you want to specialize more in the tank tree. Dark Templar allows you to do extra damage with all of your counter and retaliation style of abilities. However, you need a minimum of 6 armor for it to trigger, which is why I was mentioning 6 armor being your kind of sweet spot to aim for. Dark Templar also has a heal ability, which is based off your current armor attribute. Now, the 2 pet careers, so Beastmaster and Sentinel, can play into either camp, really. While the Beastmaster has the sort of tankier Mastiff pet, I wouldn't say it's a great choice for a tank build. The Mastiff is much better for a Blood Warrior because it just is able to soak up hits, and you're going to be squishier as a Blood Warrior. The Talon Wing pet, which comes with the Sentinel career, is great for doing extra passive damage on an opponent. It's a good choice for any build, but I mean, I would probably pick it for the tank over the Mastiff, as you know, you're already kind of fine with taking a few hits. You don't need a tanky pet, and anything that just gives you some extra damage each round is a win-win. Now, the pet careers themselves, you'll have no problem in unlocking depending on your faction choice. So, and one important thing to remember is that even when you learn a new career, you keep your pet. So, for example, if you learn the Beastmaster career and you get the Mastiff pet, if you end up then becoming the Dervish, you still have the Mastiff pet. So, it's something to think about if you're kind of min-maxing your heroes. So, finally, okay, let's talk factions. And again, another little spoiler warning, I'm going to be talking about, you know, some kind of story aspects of the book. So Act 1, you have a choice of Himba or Dryad. Now remember, again, your faction choice is going to be largely dependent on the choices you make in the story and the characters that you align yourself with. But I'm just talking about these now because I know people will be interested to know how these factions play into the warrior builds. So yeah, we've got Himba or Dryad in Act 1. For warrior, I think that the choice is kind of less more about items and probably more about the pet career that you'd want to go for. Himba gives you access to the Beastmaster and the Mastiff pet. Dryad gives you access to the Sentinel career and the Talon Wing pet. Going with the Dryad does give you access to a really nice ring with bleed, so that might be a good option if you want to grab that ability early. Act 2, Sundogs are a fantastic faction choice for the Blood Warrior, as you can purchase Axial Fire, which is a left-hand sword with Deep Wound. Now, I can imagine the entire rogue community, their ears have just pricked up at that, because Deep Wound is kind of traditionally a rogue-only ability. But yeah, this is pretty much the best sword in the game for warriors. And of course, if you can couple that with Primal Cry, which you can purchase It's very expensive, but you can purchase it from the vendor at Sandport, which is a main hand sword. Then if you're dual wielding those, you're going to be a complete powerhouse. Sundogs also have a headpiece with thorns, which is great for that extra passive damage. Now, the Cabal, I feel they lean more into your tank build because their augments, such as adding health and armor to items, and also the dominate ability, are good for buffing key items, and will be good for a tank if you wanted to buff your chest piece, which will typically have your highest armor stat. There's also the Cabal side quest, which could net you the Templar's grips, which is a great pair of gloves that have retaliation. The Silk Merchant in Seval is definitely worth building reputation with, especially as a Blood Warrior, because all of their gear plays into that build, such as the Dervish Veil, which gives you cleave, the Dervish Drapes that give you bleed, and the Dune Winds, which are a feat item which has Cyclone. The Jeweler is worth a mention as well because she has a ring with Rapid Pulse, which, as we talked about, is one of your frenzy abilities and great for boosting bleed damage. For tanks, the best shield in the game comes with the Dark Templar career, so you get it for free basically, and it's called Sunbreaker. Good chest pieces to complement it are Golem Plate, which has the Bull Guard ability and comes with 3 armor, and you also could keep an eye out for Union Hide chest piece, which has the wonderful Soul Burst ability that resurrects you, and again that comes with 3 armor. A good chest piece and a shield is probably enough to get you your 6 armor sweet spot, but you can just potentially grab another couple of points of armor off a gloves item or a head item, but other than that, it's just brawn for everything else and lots of it. So there you have it. So I hope that was a helpful little insight into my design of the warrior for this book, and some tips on how you might want to think about pulling your abilities together to make a strong and interesting build. Obviously, if you play warrior and have your own advice or tips to share, then obviously leave a mention in the comment section. Looking forward to getting feedback on how people have put these builds into action and kind of how well they get on with battling their way across the Dune Sea. So anyway, thank you for listening and happy adventuring, guys.